Fulbright Global Scholar right now and is normally Professor of Political Science at Montclair State University in New Jersey and Senior Research Scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. She's going to be presenting on Putin and Xi, Ice Cream Buddies and Tandem Strongmen, which is an entertaining story. If you haven't read the policy memo, I would encourage you to do so. To her left is Stephen Kaplan, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University and Global Fellow at the Wilson Center here in Washington. And I should also add a very funny improv comic who I long ago shared the stage with. He's going to present on Chinese and Russian creditors in Venezuela, oil collapse, and political survival. After each of our panelists give their presentation, we'll have commentary on the research by our own Jonathan Hillman, who is a senior fellow here at CSIS and the director of the Reconnecting Asia project, which if you haven't checked out, I would really encourage you to do so. It's a wonderful interactive microsite that really tries to drill down and provide visuals and analysis of what Chinese and other investment projects in Central Asia and Eurasia more broadly actually look like and what the significance of them are. And then after John has done his commentary, we'll open the floor up to questions. So please silence your cell phones. And with that, I'll turn
by example.
Yes, exactly. Do as I say, not as I do. And so with that, let me turn the floor over to Hillary Apple.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone here. I want to thank CSIS. This is a beautiful space. I haven't been to this location. It's just beautiful, and it's just a pleasure to be back at PONARS as well to speak about this really important topic right now. This question about the relationship between China and Russia has been receiving quite a bit of attention, and it's been intentional in the sense that the attention is explicit. There have been these ostentatious displays of friendship, which I think we'll hear more about in a moment, but certainly in the last year, you can see a wide array of images to capture our attention and our imagination about how these two leaders have a very special personal relationship, and all of the images and awards and celebrations to help solidify that in our minds. But I would also say that despite all the photo ops, there are so many different areas well beyond this kind of grandstanding that show this rapprochement or this relationship has been tightening in recent times. Certainly as the United States pulls away from China and its current trade wars and continues and extends the sanction regime on 700 companies and individuals on Russia that began after the war in Ukraine, we can see that in that context of strategic competition, Russia and China have good reason to look for new areas of collaboration and cooperation. So what I want to talk about today is to go a little bit into some of the areas where we see increased economic and military cooperation, and then ask the question of whether or not this partnership that we're seeing is really, as many have described it, a matter of convenience, or whether there's some basis for a deeper and longer lasting realignment of great power politics, where we can see an enduring closeness which is new in some sense from what we've experienced from much of the 20th century between Russia and China. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the potential hurdles or stumbling blocks we might come across, which could raise the question of whether this is an enduring realignment and rapprochement, and then conclude with some of the ways I feel that actually we can see, due to similar norms and interests and worldviews, we can actually expect an enduring rapprochement between these two leaders and these two countries. So there are many things you could point to. We certainly have lots of screens here. There's over a timeline where in multiple areas there's intensified relationships between these countries. If you want to break them down by area in terms of economic cooperation, certainly there's been increased trade levels. Russia pursued this very actively following the sanction regime and the self-imposed boycott on Western goods. As a result of that, the level of trade has increased significantly, over 20% in 2018, and we'll see where it is for 2019, but it continues to grow. China is the largest trade partner for Russia, and certainly the largest source of foreign direct investment. But it's not all one-sided. Russia has been an important supplier of hydrocarbons for China, and it has become the greatest supplier of crude oil, electricity imports, and also arms imports since the last 2 or 3 years. And we have seen this deliberate attempt to nurture and to improve this relationship through free trade agreements and cooperative agreements between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, and trying to find common ground for those 2 countries. And then again, we see massive investments, in part through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also through efforts to secure China's access to oil and gas in the future, including this really remarkable $400 billion investment in this new gas pipeline, the Power of Siberia, which has been moving apace. So, in fact, it's not just a matter of images, although there is plenty of that. There's also important areas of economic integration going on between these 2 economies. We can also see areas in terms of the military and levels of cooperation there. There have been, I'll get back to this in a moment, but there have been a period where Russia was really hesitant to sell to China its most advanced technologies. But in fact, this has changed in recent years, certainly since the war in Ukraine, where Russia has been willing to sell China its most advanced fighter jets, surface-to-air missiles, and submarines after a long period of resistance for fear of losing market share should those technologies be reproduced and re-engineered and sold in international markets. So this has also changed. There have also been pretty well-publicized efforts of joint military exercises, naval exercises, and not just in the Sea of Japan, for example, but also in the Mediterranean Sea. This is a little bit different because, in fact, that's pretty far out of China's sort of normal sort of sphere of interest, and yet they've been very ostentatious in that sense as well, to make sure they're capturing the attention. And much ado was made in terms of China's participation in the Vostok military exercises in the summer of 2018. They sent 3,000 troops. Now, some of the numbers of the troop levels in that exercise have been questioned, but certainly it's a significant symbolic change, because the Vostok exercises traditionally were seen as a way for Russia to advance its preparedness for vulnerabilities resulting from China. So to include China in that exercise was given a lot of attention and very significant. So there are many areas besides the dumpling diplomacy we're seeing, and yet there are reasons why we might be a little skeptical. Certainly there are reasons why we've had traditionally a lot of tensions between Russia and China. And I think the most significant is the rivalry in Central Asia. And because it's so significant, I'll return to that. And of course, we have a whole panel, right, after this one on Central Asia for that reason. It's so important in the Chinese-Russian relationship. But let me just mention a few other brief ones before I return to Central Asia. There have been tensions over the border. Certainly, this has been true for a very long time. These have been resolved since 2005. There was a border skirmish, a small war in 1969. Even though I think the biggest concern are the tensions that come from shuttle traders and migration. It's a result of sort of very disproportionate concentrations of populations north and south of the Amur River, where there are estimates of about 6 million Russians, but well over 100 million Chinese south of the river. So this creates tensions and anxieties, which you used to hear quite a bit about in the Russian press, and much less than used to be the case. So certainly the control of a narrative has been something that has been given some attention to diminish those tensions. You also see another area for potential tensions going forward in this relationship could be related to this race for the Arctic sea routes. This is something that both Russia and China have a keen interest in advancing their concerns and their preferences. For China, this could reduce the transit time by 13 days to get goods to Northern Europe from China. And for Russia, this is an important possibility for collecting rents in the Arctic should the polar ice caps melt further, extending the period of time when this is a possible commercial sea route for Chinese goods. So this is an area where you could expect could potentially be an area of tension. But for now, China has been welcomed as an observer in important organizations of Arctic organizations that Russia has been extremely active. And And then, as I mentioned earlier, we might anticipate a stumbling block or a hurdle going forward related to weapons. There were accusations of China reverse engineering Russian technology, and this was the reason why it was cut off for so long. This has been changed now. Multi-billion-dollar worth of weapon deals have gone through, in part because Russia is in need of capital after the sanctions regime. So this has been an important source of income. But in the future, should they find that they're losing market share when these technologies are reproduced and sold, this could be an area for tension. But in truth, the area that seems most prominent in my own thinking is this rivalry in Central Asia, which for now has been explicitly, I would say, downplayed by both sides, because it certainly is something you could expect with the Belt and Road Initiative, creating all sorts of competitions in the regions and questions about whether Russia will be losing influence in one of its traditional spheres of influence and one of its own self-proclaimed, special areas. So this is because for such a long time, certainly in the Soviet period when these were all one country, but even in the post-Soviet period, Russia remained the dominant actor. Elites had more identification with Russia than with China. There has been a real shift in terms of economic activity toward China. China is the #1 foreign direct investor for quite some time in Central Asia, and it's also, it's not only that the scope of these investments are so significant, it's also that they're going to shape commerce going forward. The fact that China is positioning itself as a hub of commerce and influencing the development of transportation, of railway lines, of roads, of pipelines, all of this is really significant for future economic activity. It's actually either, in some people's minds, a very brilliant strategy, a way to deal with its enormous capital reserves, or a potential for creating resentments in the region and having an enormous number of non-performing loans through investments that won't get repaid. So it's not clear whether this strategy will pay off in Central Asia in the long run, previous sphere of influence. And so for me, there's something I could anticipate happening if Russia were able to be stronger. But just like Russia was weaker in the 1990s and unable to influence the growing Western between the U.S. sensitive reorientation of.
Yes, and thank you. I believe China and Russia has a lot of bearing on what goes on in terms of reconnecting Asia. So I'm going to begin where Hillary just ended with the enduring partnership. I share that viewpoint. I see the China-Russia partnership as strategic and having a normative basis, as she explained. I just came back from 4 months in Shanghai and a month in Vladivostok, and I encountered many unexpected and surprising viewpoints about China-Russia relations, which helped me to reassess a bit how I understand this relationship. And I think if we're still discussing this issue, marriage of convenience or alliance, it's because when analysts look at this relationship, we often focus on one level or another, or one dimension or another of this relationship, and we speak to one set of people but not other people. And I think the partnership looks different depending on what level you're focusing on. And so I'm going to begin with the personalities, with Xi Jinping and Putin, and the astonishing cordiality they seem to demonstrate in their interpersonal ties, or at least try to highlight for others. They have met nearly 30 times, and they have personally expressed a high degree of mutual support for one another in terms of attending various ceremonies, World War II ending ceremonies that many Western leaders avoided for various reasons. They gave each other top awards. But what I began with in my memo, which will be published down the road, is the personal meetings that they seem to have, the personal moments where Xi Jinping teaches Putin how to make steamed buns, and Putin gives Xi Jinping his favorite ice cream, iceberry Russian ice cream, on 2 different occasions. They celebrate their birthdays together, and they wax eloquent in the media about how much their friendship means to them. And so at breakfast, Andrew Barnes, my colleague, and I were talking about this, and he suggested I call this soft-serve diplomacy. So I think this personal element is different and unexpected, and it helped me formulate the question: what do they talk about in these ice cream soirees, or what do they learn from one another? And I think there is some mutual learning that we can see in their interactions. For example, if we look at anti-corruption activities, I mean, both Russia and China have serious corruption problems. In 2014, you see Russia requiring officials to declare their offshore assets. In China, which is also in the midst of an anti-corruption drive, 2017, China passes a similar law. In Russia, in 2012, NGOs have to register as foreign agents if they want foreign funding. In China, a similar law is passed in 2017. And so I think that Xi Jinping is looking at what some of the tactics that Russia and Putin have used in trying to cement his authoritarian rule. And Xi Jinping also appreciates Putin's high-profile style of leadership. In China, Putin is very popular as a leader. There are lots of books about him in Chinese bookstores, and people admire Putin because he's a man of action, as opposed to the very scripted behavior of Chinese leaders. And we see Xi Jinping breaking away from Deng Xiaoping's mold of leadership, where you focus on domestic issues and you don't act too assertively. I don't think China would want to act as assertively as Russia in or along the same lines, but the leadership model, I think, has some appeal. Similarly, we see Putin learning from Xi Jinping how to control the internet. The Great Firewall of China is of interest to Putin, who is seeking to enhance state controls over the internet space. We saw Putin in March 2018 give a speech where he talks about building the Russia we all dream about. And this, of course, is building on the China dream that Xi Jinping has often discussed. And I think also together, they have created a normative basis for their partnership in terms of both supporting plans at the UN for digital sovereignty, for example, creating alternate norms for managing the information space. We see them using similar tactics in their own neighborhoods in terms of their incrementalism in how to project power abroad. Our colleague Corneli from Georgia didn't make it to this meeting, but he talked about Russia's borderization strategy, how Russia expanded its borders at the expense of Georgia. And with respect to China and the South China Sea, we often talked about a cabbage strategy where disputed islands are wrapped in layers of fishing boats and Coast Guard vessels and so on to enhance China's control in that neighborhood. Disinformation. We see both Russia and China using disinformation and influence campaigns overseas, Russia in the US and Europe, and China in Australia, Taiwan, and other places. So I think the personal interaction has led to some mutual learning, as well as solidifying their strategic partnership. And it also helps bond together their shared views of domestic and global governance. So this being said, despite all of the ice cream activities and bun making and the shared viewpoints and the mutual learning, the flip side of personalism is that the political centers in each country control the relationship. And this was very striking to me when I was in Vladivostok, how little regional content there was in an area that was adjacent to China. And that what motivates the relationship are the politicians in Moscow and Beijing and the state-owned enterprises that support them in energy, in military, even in agriculture and finance. And so you have very weak transborder integration, and partly this has to do with weak support by each country for regional governments and regional development, and also has to do with complicated regional politics. One example of this was the failure of a Chinese company to move forward with a water bottling project in Lake Baikal in Siberia that attracted so much opposition that people were sending petitions to Putin opposing it. And this was a deal that had been in the works for many years. And I think in the Russian border regions, we have interest in working with China, but not just China, also with Japan and South Korea. And in the Chinese border regions, there's interest in working with other regions of Russia, like the northwest of Russia or the Volga region that might be in a better economic position. And as Hillary mentioned, strong ties between the leaders and the two centers don't always trickle down to regional interests. Central Asia, we heard about. Also the Arctic is an area where we have some differences of interest between China and Russia, and also in their policies towards the United States, we don't always see identical interests and goals. But so what do we conclude from all of this? How do we weigh the weak regional ties, the differences that they experience in working in other areas like Central Asia and the Arctic? I think for now, the strong top-level support for the Sino-Russian partnership implemented through the state-owned enterprises and the priority they both set to certain normative goals really cements the partnership together. And the differences that they have in areas like Central Asia and the Arctic are not enough to derail this. But often we hear that this is an asymmetric partnership, and it is likely to be unstable because of that. One Chinese colleague said that it's not unequal, but asymmetric, and that means that the two can find complementary interests. But asymmetry is a difficult situation to manage too. And China can't always dominate, even though China might have more economic power. Russia has proven that it has obstructive and destructive power in many ways. And so Russia can withhold certain goods, for example, in the Arctic, or impede China in Central Asia, as some Chinese colleagues have suggested. And also China has vulnerabilities of its own. So I think that this is a strategic and normative partnership, but an asymmetric one, and it will be interesting to see how the two countries continue to interact within these parameters.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, Steve?
Excellent.
Your help is on the way.
Best for me right now. But in any event, basically my goal here today is to look at an out-of-sample case that's far from home for both these countries, to raise the question, to what extent do they really share this norm or value of kind of pushing against the current economic system? And might there be some variation between these two powers?
So you just click right on this.
Still not me. Let's see.
Oh, it's not yours?
No.
Okay.
Here, I have. Always come with a pen drive.
Yeah, always be prepared.
There you go. Here you are. So anyway, I am not a Russian expert. Although my Aunt Sharon, who's dealing with sort of her boredom of retirement by traveling around the globe and surprising long-lost relatives, has told me that indeed, I come from a long line of Russians, right? So maybe this is opening sort of a new branch of research for me. But effectively, in analyzing, examining Venezuela, what I've tried to look at is some of the differences between China and China and Russia's approach within Venezuela. So if we go to the beginning the other way, there we go. There we go. All the way, yep. All right. Oh, one forward, there we go. All right, so the tale of two creditors. China and Russia's investments in the developing world. What can we learn about China and Russia when we look at out-of-sample cases within other regions, right? Do we see the same themes and the same cooperation between China and Russia? Or might there be fissures that other developing countries could try to exploit, right? To some extent, we've seen Venezuela do that recently. So first, in the world of finance, right, one thing that's certainly important to underscore is that Russia is not China, right? We've already heard, right, through Hillary's presentation earlier about the difference in terms of economic influence and power of China relative to Russia. And you can see here, this data comes from the Bank of International Settlements, basically your global central bank that keeps data on all banking activity internationally. And you can see the difference since the 2008 financial crisis, where effectively, you have a withdrawal from Germany, United States, United Kingdom in terms of their financing globally after the crisis. It's starting to come back to some extent within the United States. But you see the big climb in terms of overseas financial activity of China, right? And this is the big story. Of course, in a place like Venezuela, Russia sees China doing this, right? Able to exert influence in the Western Hemisphere and says, okay, to what extent might Russia be able to do something similar? But an important thing to keep in mind, I think, as we ask this question, how do the two approach the international system, is look at this difference, right? Russia is basically, in terms of overseas financing, comparable to where Brazil is, right? So to some extent, a rising future power, but in no way equivalent to the kind of financial flows we've seen from China internationally. China is now one of the top 5 bank creditors internationally. You can also see this in terms of global banking networks. The share of countries in the world reporting to the BIS, what percentage of those countries do China and Russia have banking operations in? You can see China also has a lot larger banking operations globally than Russia as well. This is also interesting when you look at, this comes from the Russian Central Bank, the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Total Russian bank loans to Eurasia are about $13 billion. If we look at just the China Development Bank, no other bank within China, but just the China Development Bank, and look at what it has extended to Eurasia, it's about $36 billion. Of course, that does include Russia to some extent, but even if we back Russia out of that, you're at about a $10 billion figure, pretty close to the level that all Russian banks have within the region, and that's just the China Development Bank, right? Not accounting for China Export-Import Bank, the top 4 commercial banks, all these other players. This is just the breakdown in this graph of Russian bank loans to Eurasia, for those of you who are interested, mostly going to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So we can ask the question, how does their approach to finance compare in the developing world, right? Do we just see sort of an attempt to upend the current economic order, or are there differences between these two powers? So first of all, China and Russia's investments tend to share a long-term horizon, but I would say that their foreign policy aims, and particularly their foreign economic policy aims, are quite different. Russia, oftentimes, particularly within Venezuela, appears more willing to challenge the United States, finding a target country where it could use its financing to make a broader geopolitical point, right? Comparatively, China has, at this point, a large financial economic stake in the current economic order, right? So yes, maybe it wants to challenge the United States, but I would say what the two have in common is more a commitment to multilateralism. I think China likes the current economic system, just wants to be able to have a greater influence in the rules of the game. And China also, compared to Russia, has a soft power image oriented towards development, South-to-South cooperation, and being a defender, right, of sort of liberal status quo. They're trying to project this kind of image, where I think comparatively Russia's more apt rhetorically, from what I can understand, you're all the experts, not me, but trying to project rhetorically more of a commitment to trying to upend that system. So what I want to do then is now look at Chinese financing in Latin America, in a place like Venezuela, and look at the kind of effect it is having, right? Because I think not only is it important to compare what China and Russia are doing internationally, but then think about what's happening in developing countries, right? To really try to measure the extent of influence or effect that China may be having. So I'm going to walk with you through the China case, which is part of a broader book project about the rise of China in the Western Hemisphere, but also trying to make some stylized points in my analysis relative to Russia, which of course I'm learning about as I go along as well. Okay, so first, in terms of China, a big feature of their lending, which they have in common, right, with Russia, right? They both sort of, in their cooperation, have pronounced a commitment to non-intervention. And unlike Western stringent policy conditionality, Chinese investors tend not to impose onerous conditions. Effectively, they have a commitment to non-intervention. So you could ask the question, right? If you're lending to a debtor abroad, to a borrower abroad, how do you ensure you get repaid? Right? Part of policy conditionality from a Western standpoint, things like budget discipline, transparency, privatization, all these different concepts, deregulation, part of it is oriented towards sort of an ideology, but part of it is also oriented towards getting repaid, right? If you have budget discipline, if you keep your macro house in order, you're more likely to repay your debtors. So if you don't have this, how do you get repaid, right? So what we see China doing as it expands its financial stake is using commercial ties in order to hedge against this risk. So one thing we've seen, a tool that China uses quite frequently, is oil for loan contracts. So essentially what China will do is say, okay, we'll lend state to state to a central government, but in exchange for that, the state oil company will send oil shipments to Chinese importers, will then take the proceeds of those oil shipments and repay the debt. So effectively, the debt is collateralized through oil. So we see a commitment to these kind of tools from China and other tools as well, such as guaranteed contracts with Chinese firms, buying Chinese machinery, all as a way to try and expand the web of Chinese ties internationally, right? We see financially this pie is growing, and in addition to this pie growing financially, what China ultimately is trying to do is drive these other things, right? FDI, trade. Essentially, when you think of classical economics from the Western standpoint, we look at land, labor, capital. These are the ways that we spur economic activity. Essentially, to some extent, China adds infrastructure, right? They believe if you invest in infrastructure, that can spur economic activity, right? So the idea is that you have these big policy banks, they're lending in infrastructure finance, and maybe that can catalyze trade and investment flows ultimately. So some of the other features of Chinese finance, right, are basically a long-term maturity, as we talked about, but also a high risk tolerance, right? Where the West, if there's an economic downturn, money tends to flow out, right, of developing countries and because of the uncertainty, right? Think of a place like Argentina today. There was electoral uncertainty and the capital all flew out, creating lots of volatility. Comparatively, when there are these volatile periods, China has used that as an opportunity to come in and purchase cheap assets and try to grow market share over time. So rather than judging profitability just based upon one firm, China tends to use this banking in order to create markets, grow markets. So that's a big difference from what we've seen from Western financing historically. And in fact, what you can see is in a place like Brazil, every time there's sort of an economic downturn, this is foreign direct investment of China, China tends to come in and buy assets, right? So then the question is, why do we care about this? Why, even as a group of Russian experts, right, why should you possibly care about what China is doing in Venezuela? It's a good example, right, for the kind of influence economically that China can have in the region, and given its scale, is able to essentially increase the degrees of maneuverability that developing countries have. So then the question is, comparatively, what is Russia doing, right? So first, if we look at China's influence right here, effectively, China's lending to the region is in blue. And we see budgetary surplus historically in a lot of developing countries in Latin America, including Venezuela. But as soon as you have the financial crisis, when China starts lending to the region, you start getting a lot greater deficits. Essentially, the size of the state starts to increase. It's not as though China is saying you need to increase the size of the state, but China is giving countries the flexibility to increase the size of the state and to dedicate to sort of the political prerogatives of the countries that China is lending to. So in that way, it frees countries from the classic Washington consensus, frees countries from neoliberalism, right? So even though it's not direct, China's able to have this kind of influence within the region. We can also see this statistically, just very quickly. These are stylized points. You get a budget surplus with very low levels of Chinese financing here. As Chinese financing increases over time, your deficit starts to widen. We also see this general pattern coming through here with a negative budget balance or deficits, the more Chinese financing that countries have, right? So this is sort of, in the economic realm, a way that Chinese financing can affect the pathway of developing countries. Very quickly, just looking at the Venezuela case, you can see right here, the dotted line is Western banking decreasing going into the global financial crisis. Comparatively, the black line is an increase in Chinese loans, and the gray line shows this widening of deficits. So what China's had to do in a case like Venezuela, as economically Venezuela has not produced the way China thought, oil production has fallen over time rather than increased. So everything they've secured the loans for, right, essentially they don't have enough oil to pay back the loans. So what we've seen China do is actually try to withdraw from this lending relationship, right? So effectively, when we look at China's Venezuelan relations, not only are they trying to hedge economically, as we just talked about, but even politically, right? And we open with the geopolitical question. What they're doing is very different from Russia to some extent, right? They're trying to brandish this non-intervention image, because don't forget, they have lots of business elsewhere in Latin America. So even in Venezuela, historically over time, they've met with the opposition during the 2012 presidential elections, 2015 parliamentary elections. They're kind of always trying to hedge politically. In case there's a political turnover, they can protect their commercial position. We've even seen China send humanitarian aid to the Maduro regime, but refrain, right, from buying oil related to the sanctions against US-based Citgo, right? So geopolitically, we actually see a difference between what China's doing in Venezuela and what Russia's doing in Venezuela. So comparatively, the cornerstone of Russian relationship in Venezuela is military relations, right? They bought more than $4 billion in Russian arms and military equipment, and they've helped Venezuela avoid the international sanctions that's been placed upon it, helping them sell gold to places like Uganda, United Arab Emirates, and Turkey. And when we look at the economic ties, when those economic ties began is far different from when the economic ties for China began, right? China initially was making a play from an oil perspective, trying to gain market share in the energy sector through the use of these loans, as we've talked about. Once things start going awry in Venezuela, from about 2013, 2014 with the commodity correction, we see China trying to pull out, right? Unwind all these financial ties. They even go into a debt moratorium in 2016 with Venezuela. Comparatively, Russia comes in 2015, once Venezuela is already in dire economic straits, and starts lending at that point, showing it's not just commercial, it's also geopolitical. And so we've seen, to some extent, Russia trying to increase its commercial ties within Venezuela from a long-term perspective. When they lend, they can get equity in exchange for this lending in key oil fields within Venezuela. But there's also sort of this geopolitical element of challenging or trying to upend the United States in its hemisphere. So there's a lot more interaction between the geopolitical challenge and Russia's commercial interests. That being said, looking at sort of Russian, the court battles over Citgo, US sanctions on Rosneft, all these different things going on in Venezuela are starting to weigh on Russia. So notwithstanding the talk that we've seen over the course of the last year, they've also been unwinding financially, sort of following China's lead. Reportedly now, what was $6 billion outstanding initially in loans is only about $1.8 billion today. We also see Russia this summer tacitly supporting negotiations between Maduro and Guaido. The idea is that they want a negotiated settlement, just not on Washington's terms, but rather their own terms, and they want to make sure that their ties with the military are not jeopardized at all. So I'm going to show you a few graphs about debt, and then we'll tie things up. But when you think of the context and the case study of Venezuela as well, oftentimes China and Russia are tied together. We've just showed how their aims are quite different from an economic standpoint, right, where China's had a lot more at stake, right? The $6 billion in lending that I talked to you about with Russia, comparatively, China at its peak has had about $30 billion outstanding, right? So the relationship has been a lot more embedded. But Russia's been quite willing to take advantage of the geopolitical position to try to upend US power. But right here you can see, even from a debt perspective, China's in yellow, Russia's in red. Right? So in terms of the overall indebtedness that Russia's responsible for Venezuela, it's a very small piece. China's a larger piece, probably about 20%, but what this graph also shows is notwithstanding all of sort of the meme that we hear about debt trap diplomacy, where theoretically China goes in, purposely, through cheap loans, makes another country indebted, and then ultimately is able to make equity plays, such as they did in Sri Lanka with the port, as a result of this debt lending. What instead is more often happens is I think China's a rising power, learning to be a creditor, and as we talked about earlier, has made some mistakes in places like Venezuela, mispriced risks, didn't get the oil repayment it thought it would get, and as a result has deleveraged. But if you even look at the amount of debt that China is responsible for, something like financial markets, right, and Wall Street account for about 50% of Venezuela's debt, right? So it's pretty hard empirically to make that debt trap kind of argument. Why ultimately in the Venezuela case, what Russia and China are doing is so important is that this is the state oil company. The blue is the cash flow, right, that effectively the state oil company in Venezuela gets that it can reinvest in its own operations. The yellow and red are pre-commitments, right? Remember the lending agreements we talked about before? They have to promise oil is going to be shipped so that they can deliver the loan proceeds, right, to China and Russia. That means the yellow and red account for pre-commitments to China and Russia of these lending agreements. That means you could see this blue is shrinking over time, and the amount that they have to send back to China and Russia is increasing over time, particularly with US sanctions. So you could see that margin that these companies have, right, within Venezuela, the state oil company, is shrinking over time. So ultimately, why it's important, particularly the non-intervention policy that China is basically advancing within the globe, along with state-led capitalism, why it's important, and I remind you, China's scale is a lot larger than Russia, but these kind of issues may also be important for Russia eventually, is that, once you have these intricate financial ties and they're built up over time, and Venezuela starts to get indebted and you've made sort of bad investments, it's very difficult to unravel these investments. And so even conditionality, as we all know it, is a product of the banking crisis during the 1980s in Latin America and elsewhere, where developed countries try to solve the problem of indebtedness. So I think before China and Russia, if they continue to pursue this model of non-intervention and heavy state lending internationally, the question is, when there's indebtedness, how do they resolve it? So that's a key problem that both countries are going to have to figure out over time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Okay, John, you have the interesting and perhaps an unenviable task of trying to draw some common themes from this.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So I do have, I guess, the easier job here. I didn't have any homework. I didn't have to write anything. But I did enjoy, and I highly recommend to all of you, each of these memos, very readable. And I think each of them, while commenting on what seems to be a strengthening Sino-Russo relationship, also have some important fault lines that they point out. And so I'd actually like to focus on a few of those. At CSIS, I direct our Reconnecting Asia project, and so I spent a lot of time studying China's Belt and Road. That's the main lens through which I'm looking at a lot of this. And I want to throw out some scenarios, actually, with sort of a policy audience in mind, since we're in DC, because I think it's certainly striking that we see these images, everything from ice cream to arms sales, of this partnership, and that's very alarming to some in DC. But I think all of us are asking, how deep is this? How lasting is it? So let me throw out 3 scenarios, or stress tests maybe, that we might consider in testing that proposition. How deep is this relationship? So the first scenario is continued Chinese expansion into Central Asia. Each of these scenarios, by the way, I should say, are pretty general. We could tweak the parameters. If we were at the War College, we'd want to get really have a colorful scenario with all of the assumptions laid out. But let me just be general for right now. So the first scenario is China's increased expansion into Central Asia. I was struck in Hillary's memo that there's, yes, lots of discussion about the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road being linked, and yet I think quite persuasively you make the case that this could become a stumbling block for them. And so it's worth thinking about how might that happen, what forms might that take. I'm struck by the fact that, if you had asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have said, well, eventually Chinese security forces are going to follow some of these investments, and that's going to set off some alarms in Russia. They won't be able to dismiss this anymore as just friendly investment in their backyard. And yet now we have China appearing to set up border posts along the Tajik-Afghan border, and actively, maybe perhaps even running border security there. Certainly a common interest in providing border security there with relation to Afghanistan. But how much bigger might that security footprint grow, and sort of what alarms might that set off? Right now, when you look at the Belt and Road and Russia's relationship to it, the connectivity is actually quite limited still. There are a few marquee energy projects, the Power of Siberia pipeline, still a lot of energy trade, but the transport linkages are still relatively small, and economically not that important. And there's a much longer history of Russia and China announcing long lists of projects, 90, 100 projects announced in 2008, I think, only which a handful actually end up getting implemented, let alone completed. And it seems, and this is, I think, something that Elizabeth commented on in her memo, it seems as if at the same time they're wanting to exaggerate the strength of this partnership, they're actually scaling back their ambitions if you look at the project lists that they're putting out. So there's something interesting there. And what type of connectivity might they be happy to have? Energy seems like it's a necessity for both of them. Transport, I don't know. That's a little bit scarier. It's interesting to see Russia experimenting with bringing on more Huawei equipment as we think about technology, connectivity, and the networks of the future. Maybe they don't have any good options, and they figure someone's going to spy on them. It might as well be the Chinese, or maybe that's Snowden's advice from somewhere in Russia. So that's scenario one. We're thinking about what would actually set those alarm bells off. And with the memory, as Hillary mentioned, of the sort of belated objection to EU expansion in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, what might this look like? China's continuing to go in pretty heavily economically, security footprints following. What would it take? The second scenario is an economic downturn. I think that's not too unrealistic. We're seeing already a lot of Belt and Road projects struggle. And that's been happening in a relatively forgiving global economy. It's worth thinking about what sort of trade-offs they might face if there were more of the credit crises amongst Belt and Road recipient countries. So this is something that Stephen talked about, and I think very rightly pointed out that it's not just the recipient who bears the risk in these transactions. Debt trap diplomacy has been something that's been very in vogue in Washington, and I think a lot of it has been built off of a single case in Sri Lanka, which is kind of outside the scope of today, so I won't go there. But I think it often ignores the agency of recipients and the risk to the lender. And so it's striking also if you look at the list of Belt and Road recipients who are potentially at risk from borrowing. And this is a study that the Center for Global Development did last year. Of the list of 8 who are at highest risk, 3 of them are Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia. Not the same size as Venezuela, and so we could talk about the scope there. But it's not I think, implausible to think about some of those loans going bad. What if China wants to take non-economic payments? Would that set off alarms? The third scenario that I just wanted to throw out there is something that I think Elizabeth's memo does touch on quite a bit. And let's call this scenario a political transition or a passing of the guard or the passing of the emperors. I've kind of laughed as all of these photos have come up with sharing ice cream and going to make steamed buns and having birthday parties. But I think after reading your memo, it was the first time where I think I take this a little more seriously. That maybe it's like the structural realism that I had in school that I sort of dismissed this, but I think this friendship does matter. And I think after enough birthday parties, we do have to take it seriously. But that, as Elizabeth argues in her piece, does impose some constraints on the long-term stability of the relationship, because it does still have this artificial flavor. If you go to a Russian or Chinese border town in the Far East, on the Chinese side, there'll be shrubs of a Russian bear and a panda, but you don't see a lot of organic, as much organic support as you see official vocal support for this. And then again, that's also limited by some of the lack of transport connections, deeper economic ties. And as I mentioned, they seem to be scaling down some of those ambitions rather than pushing ahead with them and deepening their investment. So those are 3 scenarios to think about, and I think it leaves us also with the question of what should the United States be doing in all of this? I think it's fair to say that one of the factors that has been pushing these 2 partners together is the United States, both through sanctions and tariffs. And should we be thinking about using the economic toolkit in a different way? Should we be thinking about changing our messaging? We call them out as competitors in our national security strategy. Does that help us or help them? And then planning for the future, as we call them out as competitors, should we be putting into place plans? What would we do for each of those scenarios? Again, the China expansion, the economic downturn, and then the passing of the guard. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it back to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, John. That was great. Lots of food for thought on the panel. I don't know if any of our presenters want to respond, or if we can just open it up to questions. Yeah. Okay, great. So let's take some questions. We have microphones going around. I'll recognize people. Please wait for the microphone to come to you, and when you get it, identify yourself, be brief, and ask a question. Okay, so right here in the back.
Thank you. Stefan de Spiegelaar, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. I have a question to all the panelists about how confident you are about the evidentiary base that we actually have about this relationship. I mean, we already seen the contrast between very data-heavy presentation on the economic front, a more discursive presentation of events on the other side. But it seems to me that, ultimately, we also see in the field that some people say there's much less to this relationship than meets the eye. Others who say, no, there's actually more going on. And those people cherry pick the events that they adduce to buttress their claims. But do we really know enough about this? Have we done our homework on the evidence behind all of this? Have we tried enough to match all these data sets that we have, not only the economic ones, but the military ones, the more text mining ones that we now have with respect to reading the academic literature, the newspaper literature? It seems to me that there's still a lot of evidence there that we as analysts have to unearth before we can start making claims about what's actually happening in this relationship, let alone to start saying what it means for policy, which ultimately is what we want to do, right? So are you confident about whether we know enough really about what's going on in this area, and how could we improve that?
Easy question.
I think one thing in response to the question, I'm coming at it more from the economic than the geopolitical side of things. But even in my reading of some of the security and policy discourse from that perspective, I think it's a mistake to tie China and Russia so closely together, right? I think there could be cooperation, there could be partnership, but I think their aims, particularly in different developing countries, can be quite different. And I think that's what we've seen in Venezuela. And I think that there are opportunities, right? Obviously, some of these opportunities between China and the United States would necessitate an easing of trade tensions, et cetera. But if you think of China and the United States' interest in a place like Venezuela or elsewhere in Latin America, it's not that different, right? What China wants to do in terms of supplying infrastructure throughout Latin America, alternatively, we don't have companies and firms that are doing that kind of heavy infrastructure, right? And so once you have that infrastructure, many different firms can benefit from that. And the United States could benefit from giving strategic incentives to our firms, right, in different areas to compete in the region, right? So I think that decoupling that relationship might help craft policy that is very contextual based upon the country, and in certain cases it might be quite different what we do from a Chinese perspective than what we do in Russia perspective. Just as a last example, if you think of Venezuela, what Venezuela's been doing is trying throughout the last 8 months, the opposition has been making overtures to China repeatedly that, hey, you have an economic stake here, you've dealt with opposition before, maybe we can kind of arrive at some kind of agreement. You don't see those same kind of overtures from the opposition to the Russian side, right? And so I think there are these fissures that even US policy could take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about sources, because what we look at determines what we find. And I think that sometimes there's a tendency for people to consult their friends in one country or another who have certain perspectives. And so I think in my own research, I read Russian and Chinese. I look at both sides. I look at the leadership statements, as well as the data in terms of economic deals, weapons sales, and so on. But I think that there's a difference between what each country does in third areas and what their interaction is on a bilateral basis. Because I think it was very informative to know how the different strategies that Russia and China have in Venezuela. But I think there's sometimes an expectation that because of this partnership, that Russia and China are going to act in an identical manner on all issues. And if you look at the US and France, we are NATO allies for many years, but we don't act identically on every issue. And so we have to keep in mind that Russia and China have different histories, trajectories, and they're going to act differently in different areas, but not let that distract us from understanding what is motivating their bilateral interactions.
Okay, I see a lot of hands, so I'm going to try and let me take a couple of questions, and we'll let the panelists sort of pick and choose the ones they want. So first, David.
Yes, David Abramson. I work at the State Department. I want to follow up on this discussion about assessing the relationship. I'm just wondering, as we look at possible future factors, the strongest leg of the relationship, if we look at it political, economic, and military, it's the political. And if there's a situation, for example, where China were to crack down in Hong Kong, and at the same time, there's perhaps growing a sense of failures on a lot of the Belt and Road initiative, projects, to what extent will that change China's global approach and then affect its relationship with Russia, perhaps strengthening the part of the relationship that's already strong and moving beyond the economic, which Belt and Road just highlights the disparities between them?
Okay, up here.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Raghad Malik. I'm a Fulbright Scholar currently at the CSIS School, Center, sorry, at the GW. Specifically, specifically, I'm working on exactly these issues, less so Russia, but specifically, what are the geostrategic ambitions? Do they converge between Russia and China, or where do they diverge, and what are those fault lines? You explained this briefly, but nobody really talked about what their ambitions really are. What do they want to achieve, and what are the end goals of each, and how do they align or not?
Okay, and then one more question right here.
Jeff Stacy, formerly of the State Department. Just several quick comments, questions, really rapid fire. Why aren't we talking about these two in terms of all the ways in which they're ready to drop each other in a second when it's convenient for the other? They are not nearly the partners that we, by conventional wisdom, assume that they are. They have legions of conflicting interests, and they have an interest in, as soon as it suits them, don't they? That's a question of even repartnering with the U.S. temporarily to stymie the other. The last presentation, doesn't China also often have very onerous long-term, medium-term constraints and conditions on its aid recipients, if you look at Pakistan and many, many others across the world, Latin America, Africa? And finally, on the discussant sort of wrap-up, shouldn't we be completely, we're in Washington, D.C., sounding the alarm. These two countries have committed major cyber war against our country, and they have been successful. Together, they've knocked us down several pegs in the international order. We should be all out going after this. We have an administration that can't get almost anything right, yet they've put these two in their national security strategy and defined them as our number 1 and 2 competitors. What are we doing?
Okay, that one's maybe a little outside the scope of the panel, but feel free to take it if you want. Why don't we just go down and feel free to pick any of the questions that were asked that you want to touch on. So.
Well, then maybe I'll start with the first question, which is, how do certain events affect this relationship going forward? I think, if anything, the way I tried to structure the memo was to think about what might derail it, what were some of the extant factors that could destabilize the relationship. Failure of the Belt and Road Initiative, crackdown in Hong Kong, you gave those two examples. I think the crackdown in Hong Kong actually would strengthen the relationship in the sense that they both would be able to give each other some protection in terms of their shared ideas and norms about non-interference and issues of national sovereignty, and that human rights don't belong as part of the business of international organizations. So I don't see that as a factor, although it certainly could be very destabilizing for President Xi. But I'm just thinking in terms of that relationship, I think probably President Putin would have his back and support him in the UN Security Council. The failure of Belt and Road Initiative, yes, I think a lot of this relationship is predicated upon Russia's need for capital and China's ability to provide it. And so if the funds dried up, this will change things a lot. And that's not just true for the China-Russia relationship. This is true for China's relationship around the world. And I know that we do focus on Sri Lanka, or we do think about, especially in the West, this issue of a debt trap. To me, I find this to really be extraordinary, especially coming from the West, because when the last book that I wrote in 2018 was very much looking at the importance for the race for FDI as a development strategy for former communist countries that really drove the transition for decades. And what does that mean? When it comes to capital from the West, FDI was this path for development and growth and all good things, and the fact that there's dependency or dependent market economies that emerged, all of this was really much weaker in terms of the statement in the West. But in the West is actually becoming very interested in this narrative of a debt trap created by the Belt and Road Initiative. So all of a sudden FDI is not this glorious thing that somehow or another has been extremely useful for prosperity and growth, that we just need to get foreign capital in there. Innovation and capital are the source of development, and yet there's a kind of hypocrisy or at least a double standard in thinking about that capital coming from China. But nonetheless, I do think that this is the reason China's economic growth, its ability to invest around the world, has enabled it to develop these relationships. If that dries up, if the approach changes, I do see that as significant impact on those relationships, including the relationship with Russia.
I'm not sure that the failure of the BRI would be a source of sadness for Russia, because they see that as they're not that involved with it. The only projects that are really occurring are in the Arctic with the Yamal and Yamal 2. But I think what happens in Central Asia in terms of leadership succession, political stability, the future of Afghanistan, all of this will affect, as Jonathan mentioned, and what would China do in case there's renewed border instability owing to the situation in Afghanistan? Is it going to bring in troops? What would Russia? There are all kinds of scenarios that we could look at. But I think what China and Russia have managed to do is to remain neutral on issues of priority to the partner, like the situation in Crimea, for example, or the South China Sea, and try to agree where they can and to leave, this speaks to the conflicting interest question, leave those conflicting interests aside. For the time being, they've been able to do that. Whether they can continue to do that is a question. And in terms of strategic ambitions, I think they both want to have a place that they consider deserving in the international system. Russia having the baggage of being an ex-superpower and China being a rising power. But they see their regional, I think it's the regional ambitions where they see their own role differently, and where we have the conflicting ambitions sometimes. But I think that there's another set of priorities that brings them together in terms of the way they want this order to develop. And this is a product, I think, of the economic crisis of 2008, where they saw the West being incapable of managing the global economy and wanting to create another model in which they're bigger participants. And we see commonalities in terms of their approach to cyber, in terms of how they want to use that going forward, in terms of regulating cyberspace and the use of it for their own goals.
Just to pick up on that note, I think it's quite interesting. You had just mentioned the global financial crisis and what that does strategically to China and Russia. If you think of China Development Bank, which I shared some statistics with you earlier, strategically what they were doing prior to the global financial crisis was trying to acquire stakes in Western banks. So they were embracing the Western model of finance, and with the global financial crisis, they learned, I think, that they had to diversify and take a chance on doubling down on the state model. So I think that's one important thing to think of. Now, within that model, I know there's a question in terms of the costs. Obviously, we have limited time. In the part of the broader book project, I deal with those costs, and effectively where you get more macro flexibility, you're able to spend more on what you want when you get these loans. We already talked about the debt, sort of, the potential debt costs. There's also costs from a commercial standpoint, right? The question of, are you creating new dependency in these developing countries, right? Because if China is essentially using these loans to buy more commodities, and then also using these loans to increase the amount of machinery that it sells to these regions through these debt contracts, well, then there's a question of, okay, well, are you impeding these regions from being able to diversify into industry? And are you kind of renewing risks in the commodity sector? And that's sort of a very real question, as well as the middle income trap
question, right? Are these countries, when they take loans, just like previously from the United States or elsewhere, is there a risk of not being able to develop the way they envision, and ultimately, having economic stagnation over time? So a couple other kind of quick notes. I'll go through them quickly. One is the failure of the BRI, debt trap, and then finally what U.S. policymakers should do. In terms of the failure of the BRI and what that would mean, I think this is quite significant, right? Because it's easy to think about how the Eurasian Economic Union has similarities and perhaps even complementarities with the BRI if you think of it being successful. If you think of it as being something where there's a tremendous amount of debt distress, right, or increasing levels of indebtedness, then there's the issue of how do you resolve that indebtedness. China's dealing with this issue. They've already kind of published at their past BRI forum a new debt sustainability framework. At this point, it looks a lot like the IMF framework. We don't know if they're going to implement that multilaterally or bilaterally. That's an outstanding question. But there is a question, is Russia okay with that kind of approach to debt, indebtedness? And there's also a question, if you think of some of the cases today that have gone awry in terms of lending, where have those countries gone? The Ecuadors, the Pakistans, et cetera. They're going to the IMF, right? Also raising the question, is Russia okay with that kind of way to resolve the debt issue, right? In terms of the debt trap, just a quick note on that as well. I'm really a strong proponent of what, as I mentioned earlier, what happened with China is a creditor trap rather than a debtor trap, right? You lend without conditions, at least from a macro standpoint. You're putting the onus on the country to invest well, to make good investments so they can pay you back. Venezuela didn't do that. China struggled to get the oil collateral back. This is a country, too. China spent billions of dollars on sort of soft power public relations globally. Why on earth would they purposely get a country to be in debt, right? The optics on that are horrible throughout the region, right? Then everyone else says, okay, well, if China lends to you, you have this risk of indebtedness. From a development, soft power, state-to-state cooperation standpoint, south-to-south cooperation, that's not good for China, right? So I think that that's a whole part of that debt trap argument. There's not agency with China, and there's not agency with really the developing countries. So I think it's a very faulty argument, and we should be careful of it. Then the question is, from a policymaking standpoint, what should the U.S. do, right? To the extent to which, we have, as John was talking about, the possibility of economic crisis or debt distress within the region, what can the U.S. do to help solidify and strengthen developing countries? I think what the United States policymakers could do is think of looking at the ways that within a country, right, Latin America, Africa, East Asia, can you help enhance the governance framework, right, to make things more transparent? One quick example, China has often taken the state-to-state lending posture, but when that has gone awry, increasingly China is using private procurement, right, open bidding, right? They're competing in this way. To the extent that the United States and other developed countries could help developing countries enhance this framework, that might also allow developing countries to get better outcomes, right, from this financing, right? Because it could be channeled through a private sector from a more transparent perspective.
Okay, good. I think that worked well. Let's do the same thing where we take a couple of questions and then go. Okay, so over here.
Sarah Merle, Georgia Institute of Technology. In the context of increasing military cooperation, how do Russian submarine capabilities in the Arctic factor into potential tensions between Russia and China over the race for sea routes there? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Professor Yu.
You've been from Wittenberg University, Ohio. I have a question about the nature of Sino-Russian rivalry that Professor Apple discussed in your presentation, particularly in Central Asia. What do you think of the increasingly complex situation now in Central Asia, particularly operation of SCO, after India and Pakistan joined this organization? Actually, it seemed to make it SCO less efficient, though it looks impressive. On the other hand, there are other developments like the Belt and Road, like a Russian version of the Greater Eurasian Union, seeming to transcend SCO. And last, if not the least, there is a rise of the Central Asians themselves. For example, last year's March, for the first time, 5 stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, they organized a purely Central Asian informal summit in Astana. And this is it's very interesting. You start to see SCO being torn apart by super SCO forces like a Belt and Road, and then the forces below, and then the complications of India and Pakistan, they still in the state of war. And SCO actually, in the word of a Russian scholar, becomes hibernated. So it's no longer just a rivalry or cooperation. So what do you see? This is a rather complicated relationship, despite the beautiful relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping.
Yep.
This goes to Professor, the individual relationship. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And we can take one more question this round. Okay, Harley.
Thank you. Harley Walzer, Georgetown University. Liz, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you heard on the ground, since you were just in both China and the Russian Far East. This relationship is a great test of whether top-down is more important than bottom-up. I keep thinking of Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin in the Library of Congress embracing each other and talking about the great relationship the two countries are going to have. George Bush looking into Putin's eyes. Certainly, Putin and Xi have a great relationship. Whether that spreads to the lower levels, whether it's sustainable for a longer term, is a really big question. And we're going to get a really good test of the strategic partnership very soon. Putin had a meeting in August where he told the mobile phone providers that they had to find a different bandwidth for 5G because the military uses the bandwidth they want. That means they can't use international equipment. The only exception to that is Huawei, which doesn't have enough. Are they going to, in this climate, change their whole production plan to meet Russia's needs? That's going to be interesting to watch.
Okay, why don't we go in the opposite order this time? So, Steve, if you want to start.
So I guess in closing, basically just wanted to highlight, probably moving forward, I think what's really key to keep in mind in terms of both China and Russia, in terms of the economic and financial ties in third-party developing countries, is sort of what are they trying to use those ties for? And I think what's important, what I've tried to underscore today, is that China has a lot greater stake economically within the current financial and economic system. And it has to kind of tread very lightly in order to try to deal with a lot of these sensitive issues in terms of indebtedness, in terms of development, because indeed it sort of has a stake in the system and a stake in its reputation as being able to help other developing countries. Comparatively, from what I can gather with the way that Russia has been approaching third country parties, it's a lot more geopolitical, right? It's a lot more designed, particularly as we've seen in Venezuela, to upend U.S. power, right? There's a commercial element to it. Certainly Russia has benefited from getting oil fields, et cetera, in Venezuela and this kind of equity. But there's also, compared to China, a lot stronger geopolitical narrative that's associated with this. And I think it's important to differentiate, certainly, right? We learn a lot through their bilateral ties, but it's also important to the extent to which we care about what's going on regionally within various developing countries to differentiate how the two actors are approaching these developing countries. So from my sample of Latin America, undoubtedly it's very different what the two actors are trying to accomplish.
So I'm still trying to process all of the impressions from this time overseas. But in terms of the Belt and Road, I heard some interesting perspectives in China. One is that there's not enough accountability, that the focus seems to be on project promotion rather than implementation and assessment. And so I don't know that China would intentionally get into debt trap or try to ensnare countries in debt trap situations, but this could be the result of the inadequate planning and follow-up that goes on there. And there's concern that since this is Xi Jinping's signature initiative, that people are going to associate debt trap with it. And he will be remembered for debt trap diplomacy, not for the great Belt and Road project. And average people seem puzzled by the initiative, wondering why are we spending so much money in all of these countries? But in terms of Vladivostok findings, there's an institute there that does public opinion surveys of Russian attitudes in the Far East towards neighboring countries. And certainly views of China have become much more favorable in recent years. And the view of the US, which used to be favorable in that part of Russia, has declined markedly. This being said, you see fewer Chinese in that part of Russia nowadays. You see a lot of Koreans, you see Japanese, you see some Chinese tourists, but if you go to the markets now, you see Central Asians working there, not Chinese really. I think there's theoretical interest in projects with China, but when it comes down to actually implementing them, there are a lot of problems reflecting issues on both sides. One bright area is perhaps agriculture, where suddenly China needs more soybeans, and Russia produces soybeans. And so there's been a lot of enthusiasm for perhaps enhancing agricultural cooperation between Russia and China, and that involves the Russian Far East. And there's a grain terminal that's going to be built in Primorsky Krai. And so there is some action on the ground. Some of the action on the ground is not positive. Some of it is improving. In China, there are many different viewpoints about Russia. Chinese love Putin, but Russia, it's not so clear how people feel about it. Because Russia is seen as a difficult partner in general, although a necessary one, because China doesn't have many friends. And so without Russia, China would be very lonely. But what I found in talking to Russia experts is there are generational differences, that younger experts seem to be much more critical, and older experts, I think, possibly remembering the bad old days of the conflict, are happy the relations are improved. But the younger ones are thinking, is this the partner that China should have? Why are we involved in this? I don't know that really affects the leadership circles, because they're populated by older folks. And the leaders themselves have Russian experience. But it is food for thought. What will generational change, talking about our scenarios, generational change in both countries, with having more Western educated people in Russia also and in China, mean for them in the future? Well, one of the more interesting comments I heard was from someone who thought that Russia was actively trying to undermine China's positions in Central Asia through influence campaigns, pointing to China as a threat. And I thought that was very, he couldn't give me specific evidence, possibly because of where he got this information, but I thought that this was an interesting viewpoint, even if not based on evidence, that somehow, and that's why I concluded as I did, that Russia could be an obstructive factor as well as a disruptive one. And it has certain tools in its toolkit, despite the asymmetries in power. And there is this undercurrent of difficulty in terms of the actual interactions they have on the ground that is somewhat disconnected from the normative push that has strengthened this relationship. And as we look forward at it, I think we just have to keep all of these pieces in mind, and not, as our first questioner asked us, not just focus on one data set as opposed to the other.
Well, there's so many things to touch upon. Harley, I think your point is excellent. The questions to really think about what's going on at the level from, below, pressures from below the mass level, because certainly, the focus of what I was doing in the memo is looking at this relationship and trying to interpret the relationship, but I don't think there's the pathos, there's the soft power efficacy that you might want to go along with building a relationship in the long run. So again, the focus was at the elite level and government to government, but I do imagine, sometimes people point to how many Russians are studying in China, how many Chinese young people are studying in Russia, what's, in terms of that relative to the numbers in the United States. So there are certain things that show that despite the tensions at the very top level, there's going to be soft power, there's going to be cultural influences that may sort of slow down a rapprochement or this relationship going forward. And you'd have to look at, the kind of work or the on-the-ground work to have a better sense of that. But it's a really interesting question. But on the elite level, to talk about, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think that's a great example of managing a very tense potential situation. If the idea was to try to co-manage for Russia and China Central Asia and recognizing rather than being dismissive of Russian interests in that area, it was a step in the right direction. Now, if you continue to expand it, is the effort diluted? Is the efficacy diluted? Probably so. But I do think that what Russia has really benefited from and what China has managed particularly well is the sensitivity of being the junior partner in this asymmetric relationship and recognizing what has derailed U.S.-Russian relations at many points. It's this indifference to Russian concerns, Russian interests, and China has managed to handle that much better than the United States has in many occasions. So I do find that that is just one example where, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a way to try to bring in Russian interests into that region and then beyond. I don't have that much to say about technology in the Arctic. I could point you to Robert English's work, who I thought made a very interesting case about just the weakness of Russian technology in the Arctic. The icebreakers are very incapable. The difficulty of rescue operations. So I don't work on the Arctic, but I know that there's some good work out there trying to understand in a technocratic sense, the advances that are there so far and just how far there is still to go in terms of really having viable commercial routes in the Arctic. It's not around the corner, according to Robert English, for example.
Okay, we have a little bit of time left, so if there are a couple more questions, we may take those. We'll go in the back, and then Steve, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm sorry for those people sitting over here. I can't really see past the podium.
Forgetting them.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Zachary Kim from Asian Development Bank, and actually I'm from South Korea, and we've been talking about the problems, the relationship between Russia and China would have effect on Eurasia, like including Central Asia. But I was thinking about the conflict between North and South Korea, or conflict in South China Sea. So there will be some implications on other regional problems. The relationship between China and Russia. I mean, my question is, would there be other implications on other regional problems, like South China Sea problem or North Korea problem, something like that?
Okay.
Stephen Blank, American Foreign Policy Council. My question is to Stephen Kaplan. What have you seen with regard to Russian and Chinese policies in regard to the issues you discussed in Africa? Is there a difference? Is there a convergence or parallelism?
Okay, so China-Russia investment in Africa, and then this question of the impact of the Sino-Russian relationship on regional conflicts in Asia.
I guess I'll pick up with the question of China and Africa. First thing is a departure point. I think what we've seen within Latin America is essentially China investing with at least two different models, right? One that's state to state, and one that's more market-oriented, depending upon the context that it meets, right? So there are countries like Argentina and Brazil where it tends to invest more in the private sector. countries like Ecuador and Venezuela, where it tends to be more state to state, right? So just like through their domestic development, they use tools incrementally from both the private and public sector to develop, we're seeing them do this similar kind of thing, I think, within Latin America and Africa. I think as a first mover in Africa, just like the first mover in Latin America, they use state-to-state relations in what was often sort of extractive energy sectors. But then I think in both countries, as the relationship has developed, we've seen sort of more economic activity. Again, I think the way that China approaches it is using these loans to spur greater economic activity, right? So there's even been, probably much more so in Africa, relative to Latin America, investment in things like manufacturing even, right, in certain countries. Comparatively, I haven't looked as closely at what Russia has been doing in Africa, but I know even in a place like Latin America, the scale, right, of what China does relative to Russia is so much larger, right? So I'd imagine that that scale particularly is even larger within Africa, right? So I think that China is much more of a player in Africa, at least from a financial and economic perspective.
I forgot about the Arctic question earlier. I don't think technology is the source of differences between China and Russia there. I think Russia sees itself as an Arctic state and China as the newcomer. And so I think the tensions have to do with under what circumstances is China going to participate, and will Russia still be in charge? The questions about conflicts, the North Korea case is interesting because both Russia and China have certain common positions that they've made at the UN and so on. I think Russia's position is slightly different because they have a big stake in the settlement of the tensions on the peninsula so that they can move forward with their transportation and energy plans for integration with the Far East. China, I think now, considering tensions are high with the U.S., could tolerate more tension on the peninsula as long as the conflict doesn't break out. In terms of the South China Sea, this is an area where they've agreed to disagree because Russia has strong partnership with Vietnam and energy interests in that area. And so what Putin said is we object to having the arbitration court decide, but they didn't say we support China's position. So it's an area like Crimea where they have been neutral.
Okay, we are just about at 3 o'clock, so I think we're going to have to wrap up to let the other panel come in here. Please join me again in thanking all of our participants.